Bonjour, welcome to another Rog Rant. Today we are continuing a rant about the monetary system. I've been actually attempting to record videos for other channels. I did one on Rog Science. I've got to do another one about analysis of the flat Earth versus the world. But I'm so full of rant, it's ridiculous. So I can only rant at the moment. So I rant, therefore I am. So therefore I shall continue to rant until hopefully there's no more rant left to rant about. That's not going to happen, is it? But money system, forgot to mention something important. Where do governments get their money from? Government has a budget, and as we know, especially in the UK, that some of the budget is spent on things like the NHS and the police service and local services, and it's usually given about this much, and the amount that actually gets to the people at the bottom of doing the work is usually about that much because everybody else is putting it in their own pockets. And then the rest of the money, which is usually about this much, which is supposed to be for things that we don't need, like military, which is ridiculous, and all that stuff, in reality probably about that much goes to the people at the bottom, and the rest of it's just shoehorned in stakeholder pensions and other public service backhanders and freebies at our expense. But the government doesn't have the money. So the government approaches the Bank of England and says, I would like to borrow some money, please. And the Bank of England says, OK, son, well, what have you got in collateral? And the government says, I know what I'll do. I will create some bonds. Some bonds that are value. They're effectively, you could say that they're effectively shares in the government. And so each share has a value. And the bank says, all right then, I'll exchange this amount of money for this amount of money in bonds. And a very important thing here. Unfortunately, it's the same now in all Western countries. I don't know about the other countries. I haven't really looked. If you actually live in a country where this doesn't apply, you've got to put it in the comments, because this is really interesting to research. If your life is actually better for all your people than it is for us. But banks always work on this one key principle. They exchange fiat currency, which has no value, because it's not backed by precious metal. It is literally worthless. You take a pound coin into a metal facility and say, how much money will you give for this quid? You'll be lucky if you get 2 pence. It's worthless. Yeah? If it's backed by precious metal, it means it contains a precious metal. Therefore, they would say, well, I'll give you a quid because it's got a pound's worth of gold in it. That's how it works. But because our modern currencies in the West have no precious metals behind them, they are worthless. So the banks always exchange things of value, land, businesses, property, gold, antiques, that sort of stuff, bonds which have value. They are monetary documents. Yeah, like mortgages are. That's a monetary document in the Bill of Sales Act. When you sign it, that is a physical cash worth document which has actually technically paid your mortgage, but they don't tell you that, so they get you to pay back the value you just paid back over 30 years at some ridiculous interest, which is fraud. So that's how they work. Fiat currency, which is worthless, in exchange for something of value. That's why whenever you create a loan, a lot of banks will ask if you've got any equity, i.e. anything of value that they can take from you if you don't pay back the money that they've created out of thin air that has no value itself, plus interest. So that's how it works. So the Bank of England gives money to the government in exchange for bonds, where we get the term bondage, because we have to pay the value of the bond in our taxes, which goes to the bank. The bank gets a controlling interest in the government because they've literally bought shares in the government. That's what the bonds effectively are. So that's why the civil service runs the country on behalf of the banks and the military industrial complex and anybody else who's got a lot of this, and not the politicians, and not us. That's the way it's always been for over 100 years now. Now, key question is, why do we borrow money from the Bank of England? If it's the Bank of England, doesn't that mean that England owns the bank? So why would the government borrow money from a bank it owns? This is the really bizarre thing. It doesn't own the bank. The Federal Reserve isn't owned by America. The Bundesbank isn't owned by Germany. Bankless Suisse is not owned by Switzerland. Every major bank that has the country name or is associated with being the big bank, like the Bank of England, in all Western countries, all the big Western countries, are owned by one family, which is extraordinarily bizarre. I thought this was tinfoil hat territory, and I dug into it further and I couldn't find any evidence against it. But ironically, they align themselves with these people. And I don't understand why, because what they do is definitely against their sort of culture. I don't know why they do that. Maybe it's a safety net because people can't say anything about them because they'll be classed as anti-Semitic and set on fire. Because it just seems very odd that the huge amount of the financial services of the world are entirely run people who say that they're these people. I don't believe they are. I think they use that as a term, as like a badge. I honestly don't believe that these people have that sort of sadistic, amoral, corrupt attitude towards human beings that cause such oppression and suffering on such a wide scale. I honestly don't believe it. So I think it's just they're hiding under that term, and it gives those people a bad name they do not deserve. So the Bank of England is a private bank. That's why the government has to borrow money from it. Now, when the government created their illegal law for this, which was called that Act, which I cannot speak of directly because YouTube will eliminate me from history, because you're not allowed under YouTube rules to talk about this subject in any other way than what the mainstream media promotes. So there's no conspiracy there, is there? I mean, that just helps people think there's something going on, doesn't it? Anyway, when they did that, they put the vast majority of people, as many as they could, on the furlough scheme. Furlough scheme is basically an American system. We seem to have a lot of American systems all of a sudden, which we're not in America, where people who've done something wrong, maybe you've gone AWOL from the military, you've embezzled funds at a low level in the banks, at a high level you'll get a promotion. Or a policeman accepted bribes and caught in the act, they'll put you on furlough. And furlough is basically suspension. You're suspended in disgrace. That's what the legal term means, suspended in disgrace. So we've all been suspended in disgrace pretty much by our wage enslavers with partial pay. You can either have partial pay, no pay or full pay, and partial pay. Now, interestingly, all the government and civil service have not been on that scheme, and they've all been accepting full pay. Most of them have been told to stay at home at full pay, and the government have been expecting us, the people that they're underpaying on purpose and treated like criminals, contrary to Section 13 of the Human Rights Act, which says that all people are innocent until proven guilty, by saying that we are guilty of having a disease even though they have no evidence of it, therefore we have to quarantine ourselves from society, which is inhumane and both illegal and undemocratic. Well, when they did that anyway, they said that to pay for this scheme, they've had to borrow loads of money, and there's like 50-odd billion pounds worth of debt that they owe to the Bank of England. And I thought to myself, well, that's a bit weird, because until I knew that the Bank of England was a private bank, I thought, well, if the Bank of England's part of England, you wouldn't owe them any money. And I thought, well, how could you get out of this situation? I thought about it, and I spoke to some people who know about these things, and I discovered that all that has to happen to eliminate national debt to the bank is the Chancellor, or the Prime Minister preferably, comes on an independent broadcast. No, it says now is a broadcast by our puppet Prime Minister, representing our false democracies. And all he has to say is these exact words, apparently, to make it legal. But from today, the Bank of England is now part of the Treasury. Now, I couldn't believe it's that simple, but it actually is. If he says that, the Bank of England, which is on the sovereign soil of the United Kingdom, or of England itself, which is owned by the Queen, because we don't own it, I think she owns everything, that then becomes part of the Treasury, which means it becomes part of the United Kingdom, it becomes part of the government, which means the bank cannot loan money to its owner, because it owns it. So we don't owe money to the bank because we own the bank, so the debt is instantly nulled. And all of a sudden, poverty drops, doesn't it? Taxes should drop, quality of living should increase. So why have they never done that? Now, Michael Tellinger, he's an interesting guy who I thought wore a tinfoil hat, but I followed his research into the stones in South Africa and his scientific studies, which he's done with lots of proper scientists. And he really is onto something very major there about human civilization and its true origins and what the hell those things are for. He had an analogy about how the monetary system works, which is spot on, and I shall attempt to relate it with my crap diction and my dodgy enunciation. A salesman goes into a hotel. He sees the hotel manager. He says, I'm here for the weekend, he says. I need a room for the weekend, he says, but I'm very fastidious. He said, is there any chance I can see what rooms you got free and have a look and see if there's one I like? Hotel manager goes, yeah. He says, well, it's £100. He says, but all the top floor's free, so here's the keys. Go and have a look. So the salesman puts a $100 bill on the counter, goes upstairs. Hotel manager goes in the back. The butcher comes in. Johnny says, I've got your meat delivery for this week. And the hotel manager's in the back, and he goes, how much do I owe? He goes, $100. And he goes, all right then. So the butcher puts the meat on the counter and sees the $100 bill. Picks it, goes, thanks, John. Walks out. Gets in his truck, he's driving down the road. It's a bit later on, it's getting dark. He sees the local mechanic at the garage, pulls over. He goes, all right, Steve, he says. All right, says Steve goes, how's the van? The van's great, thanks, mate. He says, how much do I owe? Steve goes, $100. So he gives him the $100 bill, gets in the van, drives off. It's a bit later on, it's getting quite dark now. Mechanic's working away. And a prostitute walks across the street. And he hears this wolf whistle and he looks at her and he goes, hello, Trixie. And she goes, hello, Steve. And she comes up to him and she says, last week was great, wasn't it, last weekend? And he goes, yeah. He goes, how much do I owe? She goes, $100. So he gives her the $100 bill. Trixie crosses the road, walks into the hotel. There's nobody at the desk, and she goes, John, she goes, and she hears the voice in the background. She goes, yeah. She goes, I've got the $100 owe you for last weekend. He goes, thanks, Trix. Puts it on the counter, walks out. Salesman comes down the stairs. The hotel owner comes out, and he goes, what did you think? He says, well, I had a look. He says, I'm sorry. He says, but you haven't got any rooms alike. He says, terribly sorry. Puts the keys on the table, takes his $100 bill off the desk, and walks out. That's how the monetary system works. We do all the work. All it does is it stops us from doing things. As usual, comments down below, and don't forget, it's not reality, it's YouTube.